Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Work, where we are in the second session of taking evidence about models of social work. It's part of a project which the All-Party Parliamentary Group is doing, where a range of parliamentarians with an interest in the social work profession have been looking at some of the issues that affect the profession in terms of who they're employed by, how their employment operates, the effectiveness of those models at supporting the vulnerable people that social workers are employed to do, and also what professional issues that highlights for social workers as they develop their career, move into management positions. Clearly, it also brings into play the private sector, the voluntary sector, and academic research, which is enormously relevant. Today, we have a number of parliamentarians on the call who have a range of questions which we're going to put to you. Many of those we're putting to all of our witnesses in order to try and get a consistent set of questions that are posed with a view to ensuring that we can focus the responses in the areas that are most relevant. And today we are hearing from Mary Jackson, who is the Chief Executive of Frontline, Rachel Worrell, who is the Director of Children's Services at Surrey County Council. Welcome. We are hearing from Emma Blakemore and Darren Shaw at Innovate, and we were due to hear from Mike Burns from Glasgow City Council, but I understand Mike's not been able to join us due to a last-minute commitment. So, does that sound to everybody like what you think you're here to talk about? Fantastic. Okay, so my name is David Simmons. I'm the current chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for social work, and if I may, I'm going to ask the first question, then I'll bring in parliamentary colleagues as we go through the process. So if I may, perhaps asking each of you in turn to share your views. The first question is about your experience of different types of models. So perhaps Mary Jackson, I'm going to go to you simply because you're first on my screen. What's your view about your experience of different types of models? Any thoughts you'd like to share with us about that?
Sure, thank you. I guess I'd start by giving a little bit of background around me and Frontline and where we're coming from. So I'm, as you say, I'm the Chief Executive. So Frontline's a children's social work charity specifically, and we have brought 1,800 social workers into the profession, which is now around 1 in 7 of newly qualified sort of social workers have come through the Frontline programme. We've also trained around 500 social work managers on our first line programme with some strong results in terms of evaluation, most recently from an independent evaluation by King's College London. We're about to launch a headline programme, which is a leadership programme for those at the head of service level, so the next level up from team managers in a social work system. And all of our programs feed into what we call our fellowship, which is made up of now 1,500 individuals, all social work qualified, who have gone through our programs and are working in different parts of the system. And in all of our work, we work with over 50% of local authorities in England, around 80 in total at the moment, and we have fellows in around 125. So we've got quite a good lens and sort of view over the whole system. I came to Frontline myself in 2015 and to set up the first line programme specifically. And prior to that was working and helping lead the Reclaiming Social Work model in Hackney, where a lot of the ethos of and sort of practical application in Frontline has drawn from that model as well. So that's sort of definitely one of the areas I'd be talking about. And in terms of successes across the system, I guess I would say there's sort of two kind of core elements that feel central to every organisation that seems to work effectively in children's social care, which are the kind of existence of a clear practice framework that is understood across the whole system, and that there's a shared language and a shared understanding of what that means. In my experience, a relationship-based framework is definitely needed to make sure that practitioners have the ability to make those relationships with children and families to bring about change. And certainly in Hackney, that was a systemic model, and that's also what we teach through the Frontline programme across all of our programmes. And then the other area, I think there's a couple of sort of threads to this, but leadership. leadership at all levels of the system. I think that the core sort of tenets of good leadership are essential to child protection social work, full stop, but also ensuring good supervision at every level, ensuring that the leadership, senior leadership, are setting up a culture which enables the sort of social workers to have the autonomy to focus on right decision making and the caseloads at a level that they can do that effectively. So, and then I think that the sort of final sort of thread I'll add is around the child protection angle specifically, simply because being the most complex and high risk part of the social work system, that's certainly through the frontline program particularly, that's what we train people specifically to focus on and to have the knowledge and skills to manage that complex part of the system effectively. And I think that without a really kind of strong focus on that part of the system in the way that we do on frontline, there is a risk that the job gets too big and that the more acute end of the work doesn't necessarily get the focus that it could do if the role gets too big. So those are my sort of overarching thoughts initially. I'm sure we'll get into a bit more detail.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. Emma, can we come to you next, and to Darren? I appreciate you're both on the same screen, so you're going to need to decide between yourselves who's going to speak first, if that's okay. Fred, you're currently muted.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I think we were muted by the host previously. Yeah, so myself and Emma are from Innovate. So Innovate, we're a private company, so we work with in partnership with quite a lot of local authorities up and down the UK. We'll talk a bit more about what we do, I suppose, later on. But in respect to models, I mean, obviously that's the question you wanted to put to us, David, was I suppose we see quite a lot of different models in all the local authorities we're working with. So signs of safety is a model that we see up and down the country. Relationship-based practice, as Mary mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of that. Restorative practice, we're seeing as well, starting to grow in different areas. And I think you see us probably different experiences in different local authorities of how far they've got in their models and how far they've been implemented across the organisation. I would really echo Mary's views about the leadership and how that is reinforced. I think it has to come from the top down, and that where we've seen it successfully is where it's kind of it's from the leadership all the way down, that everybody follows that model. And I think the challenges you get and what we've seen in local authorities, where potentially local authorities, where there's instability. So you'll get local authorities sometimes where they've been good or outstanding. And when leadership changes, sometimes that unhinges the kind of the ethos and the model that's been implemented, and they go in a slightly different direction. And we've been back in my journey, I've been back and forth to different local authorities where I remember this was implemented, and then you go back 2 years later, now they're trying to do something very different. And so for the social workforce, it's a kind of a start again syndrome. And I suppose that's always the challenge, isn't it? But we see very varied up and down the country. I don't know if Emma wants to say something.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, David, the use of language is really, really important with whichever models we're seeing local authorities adopt. And I think, as just building on what Darren said about, the social workforce, if it's not stable, you get new social workers coming in. For example, signs of safety, we know that there's a scoring tool that goes with that, where you grade in terms of level of risk, and it's very strength based. But the social workers have got to have had the training on that, because it's very much open to interpretation, and then it can give families almost a false impression if there's not a very, very clear and good understanding around progress, and most importantly, sustainable change for the children.
May I just ask both of you that the essence of the question was around the models you've got experience of. So you mentioned a number of those different approaches. Can I just ask, particularly given that you're a private company, and I, for the record, I have certainly come across Emma before. I think Hillingdon, you did some work with us in a previous context. But whether you feel there's a difference between, for example, the Achieving for Children or the trusts type of structure where the social work workforce is intended to be at arm's length from the local authority versus what happens where it's in-house? Do you feel that there's any particular difference that you'd identify or that you have seen and noticed in your work relating to any of those structural differences?
We work currently in trusts and local authorities, so we've got teams working in both, and I think you can see positives in both worlds. I do think sometimes it comes down to how the systems that are implemented, the people who are working in those places, rather than actually the trust or the local authority, if that makes sense. And I think the individuals and the leaders are the critical part, because it's those people who drive what it is you're trying to do, because everyone has to deal with systems and processes, and you can make them as best you can, but it's about how you lead those ideas and those models. I mean, ourselves, I don't know if Emma wants to just talk about how we live our model.
Certainly feedback that I've heard is that decision making can be a lot quicker within the trust as opposed to a local authority.
Well, I think equally we have where there's challenges. So we won't go into different local authorities, but there's challenges sometimes where parts of the organisation may no longer be part of the trust. So they may be still sitting in the council, for example, where the challenge to access those is not as quick or speedy as you'd like. So we've seen that as well, especially when we've landed in certain places, etc., to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, if I could move to Rachel Wardell and pose the same question to you, really. What's your experience of different models of social work?
Thank you, David. Yes, I'm Rachel Wardell. I'm the Executive Director of Children, Families and Lifelong Learning at Surrey County Council, and have previously been a DCS in 2 other local authorities. I'm also the chair of the ADCS Workforce Development and Policy Committee, and it's kind of that hat slightly that I'm wearing today. What benefit that brings me in terms of social work models is kind of vicarious experience from my colleagues in other local authorities who often discuss this at the Policy Committee and are willing and indeed interested to share. So what I've experienced in the local authorities where I've been DCS is a range of different models, including models that have been changing because I've been implementing change as part of the leadership of the service. I know and have used signs of safety. I'm familiar with that as a framework for social work practice, similarly systemic practice, and more recently in Surrey, but also back in the days when I was DCS in West Berkshire, the family safeguarding model, which is a multi-disciplinary team. So we've got additional practitioners with expertise in domestic abuse, adult mental health and substance misuse wrapped around social workers. I think my observation about what works is that it doesn't necessarily matter what model you select, but stability and continuity is really important. So what we're talking about in terms of chopping and changing, whether it's the model itself changing or whether it's a rotation of social workers into and out of a local authority, that makes a difference. Consistency of practice is really important because that builds consistency of relationships with families, and that's at the core of good social work practice, it seems. So whatever model you have, consistency of relationships at its heart, a whole family focus. So obviously we are safeguarding the child, but understanding that the risks that are present for the child and indeed the protective factors and strengths will be found in the family itself is really important, and that connects to strengths-based approaches. Alongside relationship-based approaches, having a strengths-based lens through which to view the family is really important, as long as you marry that up with a really clear understanding of risks. Valuing stable relationships, I've mentioned already, focusing on strengths and balancing with risk. Purposeful direct work, I think, is the other thing. So one of the complaints that social workers often make is they don't get enough time to be with families, and they are trained and professionally developed to see themselves as a tool for change, as an intervention in their own right, just in building the relationship with the family. If you're not able to engage in purposeful direct work, then that undermines the practice model. So those are some generalities I would say can be found in all of the successful practice models wherever I've been working, and those are the changes that we try to make when we're improving services to kind of strengthen all of those elements. That chimes, I think, with things that other colleagues have said on this call. The one thing that probably hasn't been mentioned so far is, although we're talking about models of social work practice, we're embedded in a system. And what we need is models that have applicability and understanding with our partners as well. So when we're talking about risks and issues and also strengths in families, schools understand the same. What they see, what we see. Police see what we see. Our health colleagues see what we see, and likewise with voluntary sector partners, etc. So some of the challenges are not about what the social work model of practice is, or the structure of the organisation, whether it's a trust or a local authority. It's actually the relationship building between professionals and partners, and having a shared and common understanding of the risks and issues that are facing children. The most successful social work models enable you to have a conversation that is not a social work conversation, but is a child and family centred conversation about risks and strengths.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. I'm going to try and make sure everybody gets the opportunity to answer every question in order. And the second area I wanted to explore, and interested in whether you feel that you have answered this one in its entirety, really, is whether you would advocate for any particular model. And last week we had a session with social work practitioners. They made the point, essentially, that they felt no one model worked for everyone. And that sounds like a theme that's come across here, that people have said, you know, if you've got good leadership, effective organisation, structure is less important. But I'd like to ask you about that. Have you found any of those models to be particularly helpful in achieving the outcomes that you want to achieve for children? And would you advocate for any particular structures? Perhaps, Rachel, in reverse order, if I start with you and go back in the other direction, if that's okay.
Yes, I suppose it must say something, mustn't it, that in my own work I've moved towards the family safeguarding model as a way of working. But what was interesting was that although we used that in West Berkshire, and I was very committed to it there, we didn't use it when I went to Merton. And the reason for that was because there was already well-established kind of interesting combination model of signs of safety with systemic practice that was really effective. Merton was good with outstanding features, and it seemed to me purposeless to demand that everyone changed.
May I just ask, when you describe that family safety model, would you mind just saying a little bit more about what that means in practice, so that the inquiry is...
Yes, of course. So the family safeguarding model is what I alluded to a little bit earlier, which is social work teams. It's essentially systemically based, social work teams working with adult practitioners, so domestic abuse practitioners, substance misuse practitioners, adult mental health practitioners, collectively in a team around the family, so that what you're addressing is essentially the adults' issues which are preventing them from parenting well. So although it's focused on safeguarding the child, it's a good way of problem solving with the adult family members in order to ensure that the child is safeguarded. So that's the model that I was describing. I mean, it's rooted in relationship-based practice and systemic theories. So it would be recognisable to practitioners who've got those kind of disciplines in their background as well. But the kind of key feature of it is this multi-agency and multidisciplinary approach. And as I say, in relation to, I kind of sandwiched a local authority which didn't use that model in between the two where I am using that model. And it was simply because they had effective integrated practice framework already that was doing well and succeeding in keeping children safe and supporting families well. And there seemed no reason to change that. So I suppose I would say I wouldn't suggest that local authorities and trusts where their work is really sound, where they're getting good outcomes for children, where they've got a particular model, should move to another one just because I like it or because anyone else advocates for it. But I certainly have found the family safeguarding model to be effective and positive in working with families. And if I was seeking to improve a service, then that's probably where I would look to make a change if it were necessary.
Thank you. That's really useful and really clear. That's Emma and Darren, if we come to you next.
Sorry, it's on mute again. I kind of echo Rachel's comments, really, that I think as a social worker and, manager and senior manager throughout my career, I think where there's been a multi-agency approach and a problem-solving approach, I think those type of models have always been the most effective. I think where you find social work gets stuck in the system is where it's all down to the social worker to try and resolve the problem. And I think when you can call upon other professionals at the same time to work together to fix a problem, I think that always is the best outcome for children and families. And I think throughout the country, we always, I'd say we always have the same issues with that. There's always resource problems at certain parts of partnerships that can't provide X, Y, and Z at different points. And so for a family to move on, they need to fix certain problems at certain times. And I think that's, if you can bring a team together to do like the family safeguarding model, it's, you're much more likely to get an outcome and a sustainable outcome for families. And I think, if you look at things like the FDAC model as well, within the court arena, that again, similar ideas, similar model, but using that problem solving and bringing professionals together, working together at a similar time, similar pace around what's in the best interest of family. I think that is always going to be the best solution. So yeah, I would kind of echo Rachel's views around that. And I think that's what we would see as achieving the best outcome. I don't know if Emma wants to say anything.
No, nothing to add. I would concur with what's been said.
Thank you very much, Darren and Emma. Mary, last but not least.
Yeah, also in agreement. In my experience, it's you'd be back to kind of Rachel's point about changing course. If you were to sort of direct to one particular model and encourage local authorities to change to it, then that could disrupt what is already operating really well. I would say, I think, is that it feels really important that there are some threads and themes, which I think you've heard us all say as well, the relationship-based sort of approach, the kind of focus on the child. But I guess I'd go even further and say that some models that we might like the look of, if they're not implemented well, or that kind of culture and language and ethos isn't embedded throughout the organisation, then they will not succeed, even if they might be the right model. So again, I think that's sort of settling on one model would be challenging, I think. The only other thing I guess I'd say is that a lot like Rachel, again, family safeguarding. I hear a lot from a lot of the local authorities and have been involved in a lot of signs of safety. It's got its real fans and it's got its people who aren't big fans. There's a real mixed bag. I've never heard anyone say a single bad word around family safeguarding. So there's something about the way it's delivered, not just the kind of the exactly as Rachel says, the sort of multidisciplinary element, but clearly the way it works alongside what is already in existence in local authorities is working really well. In Hertfordshire, we've got units in Hertfordshire, and that's where the model originates from, and they're working with a lot of local authorities now to help embed those principles across the country. And in our experience, there's nothing but people find it really, social workers find it really a great model to work with. So that speaks volumes for me.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I'm going to turn to Baroness Tyler as the next parliamentarian with some questions. Baroness Tyler.
Thanks very much, David. Just to introduce myself, I'm co-chair of the All-Party Group on Children and member of the Lords Public Services Select Committee, currently doing an inquiry on vulnerable children. But also, for the record, I'm a former chair of CAFCAS and currently a board member of Social Work England, but standing down next month. So what I'd like to ask really is, thinking about the various models you've been talking about, if you think there are any sort of underlying guiding principles that should always be considered when you're looking at models. And I wondered if you could differentiate between sort of structures and systems that you're working within and actual sort of social work practice with children and families. Rachel, would you like to go first?
I'll try. I suppose, one of the distinctions I would make is that I think that structures and systems, in the sense of organisational structures, probably matter very much less than the quality of social work practice. And it's possible to achieve high quality social work practice with a range of different models. So that's the first principle. What I think is proving increasingly important are principles such as a relationship-based focus, a real engagement in direct work. So the kind of the way of working, I would hesitate to call it a model, but a way of working which kind of removed social workers from building relationships with families and kind of turned them a little bit into assessment machines, with a lot of the direct work being done by other organisations and other individuals, is probably a less healthy way of working, and leads to less good outcomes than social workers who really stick with families through thick and thin. So models which value the skill and the knowledge and the understanding that a social worker has acquired through training and through professional development, and the use of that as a practitioner with the family, those seem to be stronger models. I think structures can sometimes get in the way, and changing structures can get in the way, but I wouldn't make an argument for any particular structural solutions in this kind of in this discussion. The only thing I would say is that the partnership with other organisations is so very important to delivering a kind of good outcomes for children, but also that kind of shared responsibility and accountability when you're working with children at risk, that anything that helps practitioners to develop good relationships with their counterparts, whether it's in the police, whether it's in schools. So, for example, one little model is the model of social workers in schools. And that's been super effective. Schools love it. Social workers really love it. That gets into work with children often sooner than would do through a referral, an assessment mechanism. I'm not necessarily advocating for it everywhere, but I would describe it as a gem in places where it's been implemented well. So that's probably a slightly muddled answer, but I hope it gives some of the key ingredients.
No, it's very helpful. Thanks very much. I'm delighted actually to hear you talk about social workers in schools. Something we were discussing at my select committee only this morning. So thanks very much for that. Mary.
Sure, and like similar thinking really, in the sense that I don't think there's any one sort of set of systems or structure that enables good practice, and often I think it's local authorities, or more specifically frontline teams, trying to work around systems rather than kind of because they're not necessarily always set up for great work to happen. I think that the other thing I'd say is that the systems we work with now, we're already clear that relationship-based social work practice is the way, the way we should be looking. And I think a lot of authorities around the country have been using those models for some time, but I think our systems were set up long before, in lots of cases, long before that was the case. So not only have we got the challenge of modernising systems to sort of sit alongside where we are in terms of practice, back to the multidisciplinary, multi-agency point that Rachel's making, is we've got different agencies having systems that are now kind of outdated to some degree. And we've actually just started about to start a pilot alongside Reach Academy and Feltham and Youth UK, where we're doing is putting a youth worker, a social worker, and someone from an education background, whether that be a head teacher or a deputy head, in situ, in location, around each other, to see what they can come up with to work around some of those systems and create processes and ways of working that are a bit more streamlined and very much focused around the child and the individual. So I think systems and structures are obviously necessary. I think some structures enable relationship-based practice more than others, but I think, again, sort of defining any one model over another would feel risky.
Thanks, Mary. And that approach you were just describing, I thought sounded really interesting. Emma and Darren.
I think I kind of agree with what Rachel and Mary have said. I don't think there's kind of anything additional to add, other than I think me and Emma were just kind of discussing the importance of family group conferencing and using that very early on in all the work we do. I think what we see up and down the country is a varied approach to that use of that kind of process, I suppose. And where we see the better outcomes for children and the more effective outcomes is where family group conferences and family networking has started at an earlier stage. I think sometimes we see wider family being involved kind of when it's a little bit too late, and we've reached the kind of pre-proceedings court type process where families kind of start to come out, and you think, where were these family early on, when these children were when they first became known to local authorities or children's services. So we see, I think that's something that, if you could implement that. I know some local authorities implement that very early. I know Leeds use it consistently at the earliest stage, but I think that is definitely something, if you wanted to be really specific about something that could be used across the country, starting to use that at the earliest opportunity.
Just very briefly, you mentioned FDAC, Family Drug and Alcohol Courts.
Yeah.
Are you able to say anything about what the underlying principles that are there, which you think make it, effective or otherwise?
Yeah, I suppose from an FDAC point of view, I suppose it takes a lot of the normal processes. When you're in a children and families court, there's constant hearings, and it's more around solicitors. And whereas FDAC kind of takes all of that out of the equation, and it's more around solving problems using the professionals, and it involves the family on a regular basis, and those conversations with judges, etc., with the experts. And the FDAC teams are made up of obviously a similar group of professionals, but they slightly differ depending on the model. But I just think it's much more solution focused, problem solving focused, and it doesn't play, without using the words, the kind of court games that you end up with solicitors that we've all seen as social work practitioners and senior managers over the years.
Thanks very much. That was certainly my experience as well. Thanks, David. Back to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Baroness Tyler. I'm going to combine the next two questions, as they're really two sides of the same coin, which are, what are the biggest opportunities facing children's social work and the biggest obstacles at the moment? I appreciate a number have mentioned everything from new players in the market through to the impact of government policy through things like the care review, and obviously financial challenges, which are not consistent, as we know, across the country. So perhaps, Mary, I'll start with you. Opportunities and obstacles, what in your view are the biggest of each of those?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. So I think that in terms of the care review, that feels like an obvious opportunity, and I think probably I won't speak for colleagues, but certainly the things I'm talking about here, I would really hope are picked up and addressed through the care review, or at least in some guise. And again, those things for me are very much relationship-based sort of social work. Leadership being kind of fundamental at all levels, because I think that everything stems from that, and child sort of protection being given the focus that it needs, and at times can get lost. So that's sort of number one. I think that's an opportunity. I think obstacles, I think we probably know really well what the obstacles are. It feels like the obstacles have been in place for many years. There's been many attempts at reviews and change that bring about systemic change across the system that enable social workers to work more effectively. So and those, reduction in bureaucracy, the obvious things that the well-worn paths that we'll all know, really. And I think, again, the only reason I'm kind of really keep coming back to leadership is I think that is what changes those things. That the sort of setting the tone from the top of the organisation, but then embedding it throughout, and everyone wanting to act in a way that means that the things we've all talked about here remain the kind of most important priorities for every local authority or every social work kind of practitioner. More specifically, we, as you say, we could get into all of the things that block, but I'm not sure I see any easy way around any of those obstacles, bar what we've already talked about, and several of those could be kind of covered off the leadership. And I suspect there'll always be problems in the system, but it feels like the biggest blocks for me would be resolved, i.e. bureaucracy, people caseloads, people not staying in the profession, people, all of those things would be addressed through the 3 points that I've kind of flagged, I think.
Perhaps, Mary, if I put this question to you and I'll ask the others to consider it as well. Do you feel that the resources in the system are in the right place at the moment? So I appreciate there is a big financial challenge around children's social care, but there's a lot of money, for example, held in school surpluses, around 1.4 billion, far more than there is in school deficits. There's also distribution of budgets across things like public health versus local authority children's social care versus policing. I'm just interested in your perspective on, is there any reconfiguration there that may contribute positively?
I mean, we know, don't we, that the pockets of deprivation around, you know, that absolutely feeds into outcomes for children and families, and it will extend into local authorities and challenges in local authorities as well. You know, again, that definitely will feel like it's a role for the care review to be looking at those areas of budget. But I certainly don't feel personally that the resourcing is right at the moment, given we're constantly hearing about social workers feeling stretched beyond the realms of capability. So it also, it's not a magic money tree. So moving money around would of course feel like the most obvious thing to look at doing. Again, I think there's some of that could happen within the system itself. Again, you know, I again referencing the child protection point, but I do think there are some areas of children's social work that are non-negotiable, and there are others that have less strong kind of less high risk potentially, or so again, that would be something to think about as well, I think.
Thanks, Mary. Perhaps Emma and Darren, if I could come to you next.
Yeah, so I suppose opportunities we were talking about was I think nowadays there's lots of opportunities to be a lot more innovative and creative in some of the things we do. I think over the years social work has always been quite and obviously social work has changed rapidly over the years, but I think there's lots of opportunities now for local authorities to try different things and implement different things, and some of them work and then become mainstream across the country, etc. So I think that's a really positive. There's still opportunities for people to do those kinds of things, and there's a market out there for lots of different people to try and improve children's services in different ways. Challenges for us, I suppose, is workforce, and how you sustain and maintain workforce up and down the country. We see it up and down the country. The difficulties, I suppose, with experienced social workers are becoming less and less, and the local authorities we speak with and work with, they have an abundance of ASYEs, newly qualified staff, but maintaining and sustaining the experienced workforce is the biggest challenge, and it's where in it, I suppose it comes down to sometimes it's career pathway. It's sometimes where do people go once they reach that senior social work, senior practitioner type role. And I think we've noticed as well a lot over the last year in COVID that people are actually leaving the profession as well and looking at doing some different things. And it's been given an opportunity to actually go in, I don't want to do social work anymore, or I want to go and do something very different. We've had quite a few workers who've just gone very left field and gone and tried a different career. But workforce is a big issue, and I think caseloads has a massive impact on it. Where we see low caseloads, we see happier social workers and social workers able to achieve what they want to do. The higher the caseloads, and this is obvious, this is nothing new, but obviously where caseloads are high, it's always a challenge. And obviously I know Mary within Frontline, there's a real clear structure around how that program works, and there's a reason for that, in order to give people that time to reflect, learn, develop and grow. So I think that is a massive, but it's a challenge, isn't it? Because that work needs to go somewhere and someone's got to manage it.
I think that coupled with, we can't get away from, we know on a national level, we're seeing increased complexity as we come out of COVID. We're seeing young people who have never been known to social care previously coming in where there are child protection safeguarding concerns. We're seeing an increase in young people's mental health, some real difficulties around that, with either quite a young workforce or certainly inexperienced workforce. So when you couple those things together, it's a real big challenge for local authorities.
Thank you. Perhaps Rachel, if I come to you next.
Yeah, so I would agree with Mary that the care review is a huge opportunity, and for all the reasons that she has described. But there's also a kind of niche moment, I think, for us, which is around what our model of social work practice with adolescence looks like. So I would reflect that our arrangements to support Younger children, where the family itself is the risk to them, are really strong and well developed, but our practice and our practice models around adolescence, where the threat to their well-being kind of comes from within themselves, sometimes in the case of their mental health, or externally from sexual exploitation or criminal exploitation, those are much less well developed, and even the legislative framework doesn't support the work in quite the same way, I think, as it does with younger children where the risk lies in the family. So there's a really important opportunity there, I think, for the care review to look differently and think differently, and that will impact both on the models of kind of child protection practice, but also on the models of care when children can't remain at home for whatever reason. So that seems like a massive opportunity to me. The blockers, over and above what's already been mentioned, I think there is bureaucracy in the social work system itself. I think that some of what we are doing in terms of recording and administration isn't meeting the needs of children. It's not making children safer. It's kind of feeding a beast which is around data and reporting. And I think we should ask good questions of ourselves about whether we are, whether this activity, whether this administrative activity is serving the needs of children, or whether it's serving some other master, and whether that's right. So that's both a kind of a blocker at the moment, but an opportunity in the care review too. There's also bureaucracy around access to funds, and I question sometimes whether the funding streams, which often have to be bid for in fragmented small parcels, are enabling local authorities and trusts to kind of have their best minds again on the work and on the children, or whether they're busy kind of going through hoops in order to kind of, you know, scrabble around for scraps of funding, when a single, more integrated funding stream into practitioners would be more helpful and could then serve some of the needs that have been identified at a local level. So in terms of redistribution of funding, kind of gathering funding streams together and having a less administration heavy process and accessing that, I think, would be really a really helpful way forward. The other blocker, I suppose, which again, the care review presents an opportunity to reverse, is that we don't, I think, nationally think strategically about the whole system. So even this conversation is billed as about social work models, which I understand and I value, but all the time the interests of children are best served by all of our different organisations, all of our different structures, really focusing attention on their well-being and good outcomes, and having a shared conversation. So knitting together the wider system is a really important opportunity for us in the care review, and we wouldn't serve children well, I don't think, if we focus narrowly on social work, social workers, local authorities, trusts, and that little bit of the system. We need to understand children's well-being much more holistically than that. And to a certain extent, what the pandemic has exposed, and those examples of children who've never needed a social work intervention before suddenly coming to our attention now, is how much we rely on family networks, friendship networks, all of the existing universal services. And because those have been removed from families, they have discovered that just a family in isolation on its own can't do everything their children need. So restoration of that is really important in the post-pandemic phase.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Baroness Tyler at this stage.
Thanks very much, David. Just sort of pursuing that, I mean, you've already, each of you started to talk a bit about the impact of the pandemic. And if there's anything else you'd like to say about some of the sort of particular issues and indeed constraints and difficulties that threw up, that would be very interesting. But I'm also particularly interested actually about the opportunities for innovation that the pandemic brought, because I know quite a few people in different public services have sort of, in some people have actually felt liberated by some of the freedoms, as well as some of the enormous sort of difficulties and constraints. Mary, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm a bit excited about those opportunities as well, and I completely agree. Only because that's what we're hearing from social, because we've had a couple of hold a fortnightly coffee break, we call it, for social workers to kind of come together from all around the country. It's open to all social workers, not just those who've come through Frontline. And what we've heard from a lot of those discussions is, for a start, they're really popular because people get a sense of coming together and kind of checking in and having some time to think about things. But essentially, that is some of the theme, is that there are definitely areas where, particularly around the online delivery, with young people who might be more comfortable in that setting. I've also heard practitioners talk about the fact that child protection conferences are really an intimidating setting for a family, and if you as a social worker can sit alongside someone and they're seeing the people in the group on screen rather than having to be in the room, then that can make it kind of get to better results. So I've heard lots of interesting ideas around how what we've learned throughout the pandemic could be taken forward to use differently. But in terms of innovation, we, again, through the fellowship of just this in the last year, set up what's called an innovation lab, and we are funding fellows and supporting them through all sorts of different ways to bring forward their innovative ideas. And we have had some great ideas. And interestingly, back to the kind of retention point, a lot of the ideas are really stem from trying to raise social workers' morale, or at least give them tools and techniques to kind of manage when things get tough, or influence and change the system to enable them to stick in it longer. And one great example, it was just sort of described by one of our fellows as you come into the profession wanting to do all your best work, and it's literally like watching Tinkerbell's light go out. And it was such a powerful kind of metaphor. And at that same session, we heard from another of our fellows who was developing an app which enables some sort of automation of child protection systems, so that works with social workers' phones. She's been trialling it with, I think, sort of now she's got about 20 social workers trying it through. Initially, it was an Excel spreadsheet. Now they're sort of developing the app to see if it would work. But alongside that sort of more administrative diarising element, it has a wellbeing function where you tap on and it tracks your wellbeing across time. And she herself said it was what made her realise she needed to take a holiday, because she'd been doing it and then suddenly had peeked into red and wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been monitoring. So I think, exactly as Darren says, the appetite in the system for doing things better and differently is strong. Social workers are so resilient and kind of keen to improve things generally, that this is that I completely agree is a moment now. And I think local authorities are open in the way I haven't. We've got lots of interest from partners in all the innovations coming from the lab. So it does feel like a bit of a moment where we might be able to jump on that.
Thanks, some really interesting examples there. Emma and Darren, was there anything you wanted to add that, to what you've already said in this area?
Yeah, I suppose from our point of view, from our organisation, we've looked at it as trying to develop some of our own things and some of our own models, etc. So we're currently working on a new model that we want to try and launch in the next year, around what we're calling changing lanes, changing lives, and it's just about how we support. We've recognised up and down the country that there's a lot of children who kind of, I suppose, to use the analogy, that once you get on the road, the social work road, it's very difficult to get off the social work road. So we're looking at creating, I suppose, a model similar to the family safeguarding type model, but using those kind of professionals, agencies, at the same time to coordinate and be solution focused to support families to achieve better outcomes. Because I think we've noticed up and down the country that, as Rachel said earlier, there's a lot of families now that are coming to the attention of local authorities that were not known previously, and so we've noticed referrals are going up and down the country in different local authorities, and there's a greater need, and there's a greater need also for that kind of specialist intervention at the earliest opportunity. And we know that there's always waiting lists for CAMs and people like that. So it's about, can we actively find this support at the earliest opportunity to ensure families achieve the best outcomes? Because I think the key to all of this is early intervention. I think that we know evidence shows that the earlier you intervene in a family's life, the better opportunities you've got to making a difference to families. And we've noticed, I suppose, both as workers and managers and working in the private sector, it doesn't change in the fact that we see a lot of children now who are, when they reach a point where they come into care, for example, there's a lot of money that goes into that at that stage, and it's a kind of money seems, or finance doesn't seem to be kind of pushed towards that early intervention. It seems to be at the back end normally. You just seem to think if it could be put in an earlier stage, and we could focus on that part of the of that part of the intervention, I just think we'd get better outcomes for children, and we'd de-escalate a lot of these concerns and risks very early on.
Yeah, thanks. Unless Emma wants to add anything, I'll turn to Rachel. Emma, yes.
No, that's fine. Happy for you to.
Great, Rachel, then, thanks.
There are three particular things, I think, which happened in the pandemic which offer opportunities for us. So one is we massively increased the speed of our decision making because we had no choice, and demonstrated what very effective decisions we could make under pressure. I think that's something that we shouldn't lose sight of or let go of as things settle back to normal. There are some things which we can decide quickly and with less palaver, and that's in the interest of children and families to do so. Something that was really interesting was what happened when some services had to shut their doors. Because of the social distancing requirements. We had workers who no one wanted to furlough, and they wanted to be useful, and so lots of workers ended up doing different things, and a lot of that was direct engagement with families who maybe wouldn't usually have had a social worker, but where children were perceived in some ways to be vulnerable. So there was a lot more direct interaction between a range of services and families, because those families' needs had to be met in other ways, and what I think that did was that engendered pride and indeed some joy actually in the work. So people really enjoyed making a difference in practical ways, and I think that will live on afterwards. And the third thing I think was a particularly close relationship developed between social work and social care more widely and schools over this period, because there was a real recognition of the kind of eyes-on opportunities that schools create generally, schools and other settings for children and young people, what it meant when children weren't in school, that they weren't seen, and consequently really good conversations about what the risks and issues were for children and families, which kind of were much less formal. They didn't have a child protection conference or a core group or anything around them, but were more day-to-day, more focused, more interested in what was going on for those children's lives. And as I say, many more people saw into children's lives in a really direct way, which is quite unexpected, because in a sense, lots of traditional support for families stepped back. But so there were really fresh insights across the system, and we need to build on those now.
Thanks. I think that's really interesting, because what you were saying about more direct interventions with families, because I think that's not always the perception. The perception of the COVID was, you couldn't get hold of anyone. Anyway, thanks for that. And I've just got one final quick question, if I may, and it's already been alluded to by Darren, but it's about how funding sort of impacts on the types of models being used. And I guess with the combination of increased need and funding restrictions, funding cuts, obviously more and more sort of focus had to be put at the crisis end, the statutory end of services, and therefore less at the early support end. And I just wondered what sort of impact that those funding sort of issues had. Mary, thanks.
I mean, we definitely hear from local authorities that they're needing to make some, difficult decisions all the time, and particularly, as you say, in that, in the space that you would not want to be thinking about making those difficult decisions. So I think that on a wider level, the sort of format of funding and the funding sort of cycles do, as Darren sort of suggested or alluded to, mean that the work that you might want to do isn't entirely possible because you've got to plan for this much time instead of this much time, or the nature of the size of funding. So I guess, again, I think we touched on this a little bit, didn't we, with the question around whether it's moving funding as one of the ways of resolving some of the challenges we have. And I guess, that I probably wouldn't have much more to say beyond that, to be honest.
Thanks. Darren, you have already sort of alluded to this, but again, was there anything you or Emma wanted to add?
Sorry. No, I don't think so. I think we've kind of covered it. I don't think there's anything additional, I would say.
No.
Thanks very much. And Rachel?
I think sometimes we think about redirecting funding from our own kind of statutory or high-end services into our own more prevention and early intervention services, and worry that we can't do that. But I would argue that I suppose that the earliest intervention is the universal services. They're not necessarily provided by us nor funded by us, and there's a question, isn't there, about what resourcing goes directly to families or what resourcing goes directly into those universal services. So I don't think it's necessarily all about how we move funding around within our own organisations, but it's actually about how we make decisions as a society about where we provide support for and to families. I suppose that the one other thing that I would say is that although I absolutely agree with everyone who's commented that we can make a big difference to families if we intervene early, and we might be able to nip some troubles in the bud, there are also families who, because of the circumstances of their lives, will very likely need support for almost the entirety of their child's life. And another thing, again, that the care review offers us is a chance to open up a conversation about what short time limited interventions do and don't achieve versus the prospects of working in partnership with a family over a really extended period of time as they deal with life's misfortunes. Because what we know is that some families are just hit by one thing after another, and even the most resilient of families would struggle. So I think there is something interesting about kind of continuous ongoing support for families as well as early intervention.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I guess, in all families, circumstances do change, don't they? Lovely, thank you so much. But handing back to you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness Tyler. So I'd like to pose the final one of the structured questions, which is really about the opportunities that stem from this inquiry, and also things like the care review, which is to ask if you were to give us your list of things that you would change in respect of the social work profession. What would be the things on your shortlist? So perhaps Mary, I'm going to start with you, if I may.
Sure. What a question. I think, and I will start with the things I've already sort of talked about. So I think some, even though we've talked a lot about whether a framework is one framework is needed, or practice framework particularly I'm talking about, I think I would say that some guidance and a steer of some type, i.e. whether it be ensuring that whatever practice model or framework is used, that it covers off these sort of core four things, or the things we've touched on. Because I think there are definitely local authorities not working to practice frameworks still, and I think that means that decision making, again particularly within child protection, can feel less robust. And I would, the sort of, again, my personal preference is systemic, because I think that's got the strongest, almost sort of evidence-informed sort of basis from which to work. But any relationship-based approach would do the trick. I think that would be the first thing I say, because without that, I've seen local authorities sort of swing back or forward, or even just sort of talk generally and have more of an approach, a sense that an eclectic approach is exactly what you need, and you need to be able to use this tool here and that tool there. And I think, though, of course, that's true to a degree, because every family is different, and every child is different, and every social work is different, there needs to be something at its core, and I would strongly advocate for a practice framework, or at least principles of. I think that there's something about the leadership pipeline. I think, it wouldn't surprise you to hear me say that, but essentially I feel like a lot of what we do at Frontline is, of course, in terms of our training and development, we equip people to do their very best work in a system that does not always help people to do their very best work, and that's at each level, and that's through sort of strong leadership as well as practice skill. I think that at the moment that seems to serve as much as a morale building, and certainly in the fellowship afterwards. A lot of what we do with our fellows is create space for them to learn from each other, continued development, and kind of a sense of community, and a place for them to come together to learn. And we run an annual event, which is hugely popular. We do a lot to kind of fuel what we think is really trying to keep people in the profession, because they're great, skilled, clever people, and we've already talked about the fact that that people leave more than we would like them to. So it feels like a lot of what we do would be would probably, maybe never, maybe I'm doing ourselves out of a job, but be redundant if the leadership was really, really strong and we knew exactly when someone entered the profession what they wanted to do with their career, and we were helping support them to do that all the way right up to wherever they go. And in lots of cases, and certainly with our fellows, that is staying within child protection social work, and that's fantastic, and that's what we'll be supporting them to do. But I think that the pipeline at the moment is a bit disjointed. I know the Department for Education are thinking that through really carefully at the moment, but I think it's probably working more closely with local authorities about the offer and support for them to think about what that pipeline planning looks like. Those are my two sort of probably my big ticket items. I won't take all the list because there's others who will have their items too, but those would be what I would probably focus on.
Thanks, Miriam. I'm just going to perhaps add a rider to the question as well, because it emerges really, I think, from what you were saying. Do you think there are any commonalities with other parts, maybe of the children's workforce? I'm thinking some of the things you were saying about teachers would apply about teachers as well, where we maybe need to think about the children's workforce more broadly, or indeed completely different professions, with medicine or something like that, where there are a similar set of challenges that we might learn lessons across the piece from.
Absolutely, and I think Rachel's mentioned on several occasions that the need for kind of agencies to work more effectively together, and I completely agree with that. I think it's the around the family and the child feels like the main focus, and I think education is for the sort of system is further ahead from us in some ways in social work, and so there's definitely learning to be done there. I think there's different strengths across the piece. I think the medical model is an interesting one in terms of the keeping skilled people in the profession and in the consultant model, rather than having to move into management, you stay as an expert in the system. And I know some authorities adopt that model as well, which tends to keep experienced people in, because I agree with Darren that is a challenge. The people leave, and therefore we've got an ever growing kind of new young, or not young, but sort of new to the profession group of people coming through, and we meanwhile losing people at the more experienced end of the system.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Darren and Emma, if I come to you next.
I suppose there's a couple of things from us is about enabling social workers to do social work again, and not being. I think Rachel touched on bureaucracy earlier, and I think there's been a lot of change over the last few years in social work, but I still think when we look at systems and processes, there's still a lot of systems and processes and documents and forms to complete, to fill, to do. So I still think, and I think social workers fall out of love with social work because they kind of don't do the bits that they want to do. They don't get the time to spend with children and families. So I still think that is a major issue. And I do know a lot of work's gone into that, but I still think when you talk to people, they don't have the time and the opportunity to do the things they want to. And then I suppose for me personally, I'd like to see social work as a profession to be seen in a much more positive light. And I think social work is still seen as quite negative. And it's I suppose it's within the media and through all different outlets, I suppose that social work is still seen very differently to what it actually is. And there's a perception, whether it's on television programs or whether it's on newspapers, etc. I think there still needs to be a major change and push towards seeing social work in a very different way. And I think social work as a profession and organisation is still unknown to people, to the lay person. It's still people who knock on doors and take children off people. And I still think that there's a misconception of that role if you ask people what social work is. And I think that there probably does need to be something different on how we get those messages out and try and support social work as a profession, not just for the people who are doing it now and the children and families who are doing it now, but obviously for the next generation of social workers, because we need to attract the future social workers and managers and senior managers, etc. Don't know if Emma wants to say.
Yeah, I would just build on Mary's points around multi-agency partnership working, because whilst we all talk lots around safeguarding is everybody's responsibility, we all still sit in meetings where it's very much over to social care. So I definitely think, I'd like to see much more focus on how we can do even more to work more collaboratively together to get the best outcomes for families.
You're on mute, David.
Rachel.
I think it would be a little bit indulgent of me, because I might just repeat what others have already said. Nothing that I would disagree with there. I think the only thing that I would add, and it's a return to this question about bureaucracy and liberating social workers to engage more with children and with families, and that is really focus on asking the question, is this going to make things better for a child when we're recording, when we're reporting, when we're scraping up data, all of that. How does this serve a child's needs? How does this serve a family's needs? And if the answer is it doesn't really, then challenge whether we're doing too much of that.
So that completes our formal set of questions that we have planned. And it's really useful. I know, Rachel, you finished with that note of saying, I don't want to say anything much different, but actually it's enormously valuable where we can feel that there is a bit of a consensus of views. And it is coming across very strongly so far, I would say, in the inquiry. And I know Basil will be compiling the evidence in total, but it does seem very strongly that there's a theme that says leadership is very important, and that structure is less important than how effectively it's operated. And there are a number of different ways of approaching that. And that is very much backed up, I think, by what we've seen here, and certainly by my experience. I'm just going to go back briefly to Baroness Tyler to see whether you had any final questions that you wanted to put to the panelists before we begin to conclude.
No, I actually think we've covered an awful lot of ground. And like you, David, I mean, I was really struck by the sort of, if you like, the sort of the common themes and the sort of the consensus that is building. I think, you know, those points about leadership is really, really interesting and important. Innovation, you know, being sort of the experience of being sort of freed up from some of the bureaucracy during the pandemic, you know, multi-agency working and all of that. It's just sort of got some really important themes, I think, but thank you.
Right, well, that being the case, just falls to me to say on behalf of BASWA and on behalf of the All Party Parliamentary Group, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time this afternoon. We have a further evidence session to complete, and that will then feed into a report, which we hope we'll then be able to use to influence the thinking of everything from the care review to other emerging government policy agendas around social work. So I will hope it will prove to be something which is a good use of your time and able to make a useful difference at that level to both children and vulnerable people more generally who social workers support. So thank you all very much indeed, and I wish you the very best for the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
You too.